Monday night and Tuesday. Our guest this morning, Richard Michelson, is a friend, a poet, a gallery owner, and a prolific children's book author. His new book takes on a wonderful story, but not an easy one to tell. Appropriate for today, the reinvention of Hebrew as a modern spoken language. Find out how he decided to write it and why it's a great tale, especially as we celebrate Independence Day. We are delighted to welcome back to Too Jewish a friend of our show, Richard Michelson. His book is called The Language of Angels, a new story about the reinvention of Hebrew. Richard is a prolific writer of kids' book, a gallery owner. His most recent book that we talked about was about Leonard Nimoy. He's written about Lippman Pike, America's first Jewish home run king, and many other wonderful stories. Good morning and welcome to Too Jewish.
Good morning. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. So, this is an unlikely subject for a kid's book, a language that was dead turned into something living.
Yeah. Well, you know, the difficulty, this is a story that I batted around for over 15 years trying to figure out how to make it work for children. And I first came across the story of Eliezer Ben Yehuda actually when I was working with Neil Waldman on an earlier book of mine called Too Young for Yiddish. And during the research for that book, I came across a quote by Isaac Bashevis Singer talking about how Yiddish was the only language without a word for weapons. And in one of the lunches that I had with Neil, I happened, while we were working on that book, I said, you know, do you think that if languages didn't have a word for weapons, it would change the culture and people would be more peaceful? And frankly, I don't remember his answer during the discussion, but I do remember he brought up the name Eliezer Ben Yehuda, which I knew only as a street sign in Israel, pretty much. I didn't know the story. I didn't know about him. And Neil said to me that he was thinking of writing a book about him, but he couldn't figure out a way in. And he said, so I give you this story as a gift. I said, thanks a lot. That's all I need. Something more to worry about. And
it's Takamitsia, such a gift, such a bargain.
It took me 15 years to find my way in. And because it is an unusual subject for a children's book, but I finally had the idea. And actually, the idea came to me when I was working on my book, Fascinating, The Life of Leonard Nimoy, which you and I spoke about.
Not too long ago. Wonderful book, by the way.
And, this had been far from my mind. I went to my first Star Trek convention, and somebody came up to me and started speaking to me in Klingon. And they had a child with them who was about 5 years old, and they were showing their son off and had him talk to me in Klingon. And I said, kind of offhanded, so you're going to be the first native Klingon speaker, because the child didn't know English. And suddenly, like a bolt of lightning, after all these years and not thinking about the story, I found my way in.
It's a fascinating story. It's a great story in any case. We will talk much more with Richard Michelson. His book, The Language of Angels, a story about the reinvention of Hebrew, and Eliezer Ben Yehuda told through a child's eyes. When we come back in a few moments here on Too Jewish. We welcome back to Too Jewish our guest this morning. Richard Michelson's new book is called The Language of Angels, a story about the reinvention of Hebrew. He has written a number of children's books that have been listed among the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, The New Yorker, been nominated for a number of National Jewish Book Awards. And this new book, as we started speaking earlier, in which a a parent teaching his kid Klingon as his spoken language struck you at a Star Trek convention. It must have been just like that for Eliezer Ben Yehuda teaching his kid to become the only native speaker of Hebrew in the world.
Could you imagine being the first child in 2,000 years with Hebrew as your first language? It's amazing. What a story. And as I mentioned in the book, Ben Yehuda wanted his son Ben Zion to speak only Hebrew, and he was so basically, it was almost child abuse, I would say.
Yeah, pretty much. I can't imagine you'd be able to get away with that today.
Certainly wouldn't, and you shouldn't be able to. But, he wouldn't let any other language be spoken around the child in the home. And so, of course, his son grew up without any friends because nobody else spoke Hebrew. He went so far as to not allow his son to hear animals barking or cows mooing at the beginning. And Ben Zion spoke very late, and most of the neighbors thought that in fact Ben Yehuda was Meshuggah. They thought that this was terrible, a thing to do, but he had this dream, and he persisted, and in fact his child did start to speak.
There's both painful and wonderful scenes through the book. I love the point where where Ben Yehuda brings back for Ben Zion ice cream, for which there's no Hebrew word because there wasn't any ice cream, more than 2,000 years ago.
Had to invent a word for everything that had happened in the last 2,000 years. Hebrew was still being used, of course, for prayer and in the temples and for special occasions.
Chanting of Torah, of course, right.
But it was no longer used in everyday life. So all the conveniences and all the inventions in 2,000 years, there was no need to have a Hebrew word for it. And, I used to think as a child how much fun it would be to be Adam naming the animals. You get to pick a name. I never realized, certainly, how much work it must be. And Eliezer had, he studied Arabic, Latin, Greek, ancient Hebrew to find for everything the perfect word. And of course, before he had to also invent the first Hebrew dictionary, so that he had a place to put those words.
And he had to invent the word for dictionary.
He had to invent the word for dictionary, and then he had to start schools and invent the word for schools so that children would go where they could learn Hebrew. And, within his lifetime, this is what's so absolutely amazing. It's like if we went to Italy today and said, okay, everybody's going to start speaking Latin. And then, within 2 generations, it actually happened. Within Ben Yehuda's lifetime, over 55 schools opened in the Holy Land that taught only in Hebrew, and he lived to. And then, of course, in 1948, the state of Israel was established, and Hebrew was made the national language. This is an amazing story that, one man.
It's unbelievable if you think about it. Today, if you want to speak to a Jew from any country around the world, where 100 years ago, if you were talking to a European Jew, you might speak Yiddish. If you were talking to a Sephardic Jew, you might speak Ladino, or from the Eastern lands, you'd speak Arabic. Today, you speak Hebrew. It's just the one common language. That is such an unbelievable anomaly compared to when Ben Yehuda began this process.
Well, when he first moved to Palestine, as the area was called then, although he considered himself a Jerusalemite. He moved to Jerusalem, and, there were certainly a number of Jews there that had been there forever. People were starting to to come back to the land. It was the kind of the beginnings of Zionism, and yet when he arrived there and started trying to convince everyone to speak Hebrew, almost everyone, Jews included, were against him. For one thing, the religious people thought it was disgraceful to speak Hebrew every day. As I mentioned in the book, you don't take out the garbage in Hebrew.
Right.
It's a holy language.
It's a Lashon Kodesh. It's only used for prayer and study. Right.
He said, "You think our the great prophets didn't have to go to the bathroom? And what language did they speak?" But there was tremendous opposition against him from just about everyone. Surprisingly, it was the native Arabs there who were his best friends. He pointed out to them that Hebrew and Arab were sister languages. They had many of the same roots. He spoke at the Arabic Academy of Science, and in effect, the Arabs there were pleased to start hearing a sister language spoken in the marketplace. And Ben Yehuda thought that we were mishpacha. People were, we were family, and so those were among his earliest champions. The Jews were among the last people who came on board, but he started with the youth, and eventually it blossomed.
One of my favorite characters in the book is Macher, his dog. Tell how that evolved as he became the only friend he could speak Hebrew to initially, right?
Well, it took a while. At first, his parents refused to get him a dog because, as I said, they thought that even barking would confuse the child, and the only sounds he should hear would be Hebrew. But when he did start to speak, eventually, they decided that they would get a dog for him, which he named in Hebrew, and it became his constant companion and the dog. But Ben Zion got in trouble in the street because he would talk to the dog in Hebrew, and many of the other kids thought that, again, you don't talk to a dog in Hebrew. It's a holy language, it was very difficult for him. In fact, I do diverge, as I mentioned in the end notes, from the actual story.
Right.
In the book, I keep his dog around a few more years than he had, because it's a story for kids. I didn't want to bring in the actual stoning of the dog to death. So in this fiction, Ben Zion gets to spend a few extra years with his dog.
The truth is that this was a painful process. There was a lot of tragedy in Ben Yehuda's life and Ben Zion's life. His mom dies when he's 10. It's all in the end notes. I don't want to ruin the book. The book is delightful. But there's serious stuff here too.
A lot, and frankly, it's a difficult story. However, and which is part of the reason it took me 15 years. How do you tell this story?
Right.
But for me, what happened in the end is it almost became less a book about these characters and less a book about Hebrew, which I have to admit I don't speak. But it became a book about language itself. And as you know, I'm in love with language. I'm a poet, and I think most children kind of think of language as something that was passed on from on high. They go to school, they learn the grammar, they learn the words. Everything seems like it was that way forever. But we tend not to realize that language changes. It grows constantly. It never stays stable. And that we can have fun with language. We can play with language. And, I hope that that's something that children and adults take from this book, too. Language is there for us to use. And, in fact, I think what finally turned the corner, both in history and in this book, is that it became fun for the kids. Ben Yehuda, Eliezer made it into a game. The kids could make up words, try to make up words. He tried to teach them how he was making up words, and of course, if anybody, could remember the word for ice cream, he gave them ice cream, and they learned to ride a bicycle by doing that, and it's the fun, that I'm hoping comes through in this book. I definitely want to mention Carla Goodian's illustrations, because I think they make the story so accessible and so much fun.
They're quite wonderful, and I should note that if you don't know much about Hebrew at the start, or you want to familiarize a child with Hebrew, it's a great book because the alphabet is actually incorporated in a variety of ways, and pretty soon the letters come alive in a really remarkable way. It's beautifully illustrated.
Yes, that's very much what we were hoping for.
What's your next project?
Oh, boy. I try to keep busy. I've got a few things in the fire. Coming up soon, I actually just finished a libretto for an opera on the life of Edward Munch, which is going to have its premiere next month. In this world, I'm writing an alternative Haggadah, or I should say, for adults, prayers, poems to incorporate into, we're hoping, the modern celebration. I'm hoping, and this is a project I'm doing with the artist Michael Kutch. And then, as always, I have 2 or 3 other children's books that I'm busy working on. So I try to keep busy. The world's full of wonderful stories.
And this is one of them, I should add. It's called The Language of Angels, a story about the reinvention of Hebrew. Great kids book, great educational book, but also just a beautiful reminder of the beauty and power of language. Richard, thank you so much. Where else can people go to find out more about all of your rich work?
Well, I thank you. Certainly, I hope that people will visit my website, which is richardmichelson.com, and that's MICHELSON, richardmichelson.com. And please visit me, email me. The book, I hope, is available everywhere. It's doing well. You can certainly get a signed copy from me if you visit my website. Order it from your local bookstore, and it is on all the chains as well. And it was selected as well by the PJ Library, if people are familiar with the PJ Library.
Absolutely.
That gives books to
free Jewish books to I think all the way up through adolescence now. It's a great program.
It's unbelievable. So your child will have a library of 100 books by the time they get to 8, 9 years old. And this book was also received a gold medal from the Junior Library Guild. So I'm very pleased at the response it's getting. It's really a marvelous story. I'm honored to be the one to be able to tell it. And I should mention that Eliezer ben Yehuda's grandson, also named Eliezer ben Yehuda, is a rabbi and who lives in Florida and was very helpful to me in the writing of this book, and is also an advocate for Hebrew.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. When we come back on Too Jewish, we'll hear about next week's guest, get a final music.